My name is Ella. I'm a junior at Pitzer, and this is a conversation with Pitzer pioneers, Sara Smith, class of 66, and Harriett Crosby, class of 68. Harriett is an activist, adventurer, Jungian analyst, teacher, and 2007 Distinguished Alumni Award honoree. She has devoted her life to social, environmental, and political justice. Her extraordinary journey has taken her from the hallways of our nation's capital to the top of the world's highest mountains. After graduating from Pitzer, Harriett earned her master's degree in psychology from Temple University in 1977, followed by studies at the C.J. Jung Institute in Zurich. An avid traveler and mountaineer, she has climbed Mount Elbrus, Mount Kilimanjaro, and Mount Rainier, to name a few. During a series of trips to Ecuador, she started a wildlife rescue center. She has traveled several times to India, including a trip at the behest of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, to research Tibetan folk tales. For 6 summers, she trained with a Lakota medicine man on Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. Since 1980, Harriett has owned and managed Fox Haven Farm, an ecological retreat and learning center in Jefferson, Maryland. In 1983, she co-founded ISAR, the Institute for Soviet-American Relations, a nonprofit organization providing support for non-governmental environmental activists in the former Soviet Union. She serves on many boards and is a familiar face in political circles in Washington, D.C., where she works with Quakers to prevent the escalation of the war in Ukraine. Sara Woods. Sara Wood Smith graduated from Pitzer in 1966 with a bachelor's degree focused in sociology and anthropology. Sara's interest in culture has led her to go to Liberia with Operations Crossroads Africa the summer before coming to Pitzer. While at Pitzer, Sara took the spring semester of 1965 and attended Stillman College in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and she was the only white student at this historically black university. After Pitzer, Sara went to South India for 2 years with the American Friends Service Committee and experienced many forms of resilience among people with huge health and socioeconomic challenges, seeing birth and death up close for the first time in her life. Upon returning to the U.S. in 1968, Sara got involved with the anti-war and draft resistance movements, and recently she was on campus screening a film about the boys who said no, the men who resisted the draft knowing they were at risk of being sentenced to jail. Friendships from these days created strong bonds of shared commitment to social justice and remain important today. Sara has been a midwife, preschool teacher, founder and director of a family health education center, providing bilingual programming in English and Spanish. She's been a public health nurse, a hospice nurse, and is currently a nurse navigator. Since leaving Pitzer, every project that Sara has been involved with has included a component of bringing more awareness to the needs of children and parents. For over 50 years, she has worked with hand-in-hand parenting and helped to build a network of parents, doctors, social workers, preschool teachers, and others who care about children to develop skills and to support care for children and parents. She currently lives in Santa Cruz and travels often to Florida to be with her daughter and family, including an 8-year-old grandson. So our first question is, what brought you to Pitzer? Sure.
Okay, what brought me to Pitzer? I was a student at Putney School in Vermont. Oh, I should turn this on. Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I was a student at Putney High School in Vermont before Pitzer was started, and Charlie Brinkley was helping us get into colleges, and Werner Warmbrun was at helping Pitzer get started back in 1962 and 63. So before Pitzer was even started, Warner had let Charlie Brinkley know that it was starting. And I applied early admissions to get into Pitzer in 1963, the year before it started. So I was the first student admitted to Pitzer College in early admissions because it was their early admissions program that I got in. And I started, I got out of high school at the end of 64 and started Pitzer in '64. That's into that summer, and it was the very beginning of Pitzer College. There was only Sanborn Hall started, and one of my first memories was, since I was from Vermont and I was used to sleeping outside, there was lawn outside the Sanborn Hall where we were staying that had just been freshly put in. I took my sleeping bag and slept outside, and in the morning, the underground sprinklers came on, and the water came up from the ground and soaked me and my sleeping bag. And I said, what is it with California that the rain comes up here instead of falls down? And I ran back inside. But it was an exciting time to be at Pitzer because there were no buildings except for Sanborn, and I think the office building had been Scott Hall had been put in, and all the rest was just bulldozed. And I went out and watched the men lay cinder block for putting Mead Hall in, putting the third building in. And I loved watching all the work going on, and I kind of liked being out of doors. But it was an exciting time, and I remember our thoughts as we were starting. We knew we were the first class at Pitzer, and we wanted Pitzer to be a place where everybody felt that they were founders, that that the college was starting afresh every year, that we wanted to encourage the innovative, the pioneering, the creative impulse of every graduating class, to be problem solvers, to be people who really engaged in life and brought new solutions, creative solutions to the issues of our day. And it was an exciting time to be there because it was just really, it had been a dump, and it was just bulldozed, and they'd taken out the orange groves and just bulldozed it. And the buildings were being put in, they just hired a landscape architect that designed straight paths between the buildings, going up and down the mall. The mall was a straight, and lines were all straight. And I said, oh no, I'd come from Vermont, where we climbed mountains and we went out to the swimming holes and where the paths were the way the deers ran, they were kind of organic. And I said, we can't have a straight line, right angles, geometric mall here. Let's get another landscape architect. So I insisted on hiring a different landscape architect and talked with him about putting paths in that were curving and that we actually looked at the way people walked. And we followed the natural patterns of how people move from building to building. And we built that, and we kind of waited a year to design and put those curving lines in with mounds. And then we had two designs. We had the geometric straight line pattern, and we had the organic, natural, the way a stream moves, moving like a snake, in more curving lines. And we put both up and gave the students a chance to decide between the two. And the naturalistic design was clearly favored by the students, and that's why we have the mounds here in the mall. So
yay.
It was.
Yes.
That was it for.
Okay. So I'm glad to be here today and glad to be able to share with you. I've thought about what I want to say about why I came to Pitzer a lot. I usually don't talk about it so much, but it has partly to do with trauma and curiosity and good fortune. So what was happening for me is that I was at USC for 2 years before I came here. So I came as a junior. I was in the starting classes. So there were 3 seniors, 10 of us who came as juniors, about 20 people who came as sophomores, and I forget, 50 as freshmen. And but my way in was that the context of it is that I had some traumatic experiences when I was 6 years old. I was with someone who was abducted, and they weren't kept long, but it was enough to scare me terribly. And there was very little understanding of children's mental health. And it was just, don't talk about it. And, everything's okay. She didn't get hurt. So move on. But the next day I was in first grade. I couldn't read. And I couldn't read. I got all through college not reading. So it's a story, and it's not one that's easy to talk about, because it's what I had to do was to try to get by, to try everything I could do. And I was, everybody says Sarah's very friendly, but I had to make friends to ask them things because I wasn't reading it. So I was asking people, what happened in the War of 1812, or what was this? And I had to have enough friends that nobody said, didn't you read it in the book? And so my mother knew I was struggling with reading, and she would help get my application into USC, but it was way too much for me to be at USC in those gigantic classes. And my older sister was at Pomona. So my mother heard about Pitzer, and she helped fill out the application and send it in. And I think my grades weren't good. I mean, I just had sort of C's and D's, I think. And so I'm not a typical Pitzer person. And I think there was originally a rejection letter that I got. But that summer, I had tons of curiosity and interest in things. And I was trying to make sense of the world from my experience, what I could figure out. And so I wanted to go to, there was a program called Operation Crossroads Africa that was out of New York City. And they took groups of young people from around the United States to different countries in Africa. And I just wanted to go. And so I got accepted in that program. And I went to Liberia for a summer. And when Pitzer heard that I was doing that, they changed their mind and they accepted me. They thought, well, she's doing something interesting, so we'll let her in. And so due to this, good fortune, I was accepted to Pitzer. And then that's just how I got here. But then Pitzer still had to deal with the fact that I wasn't reading. So I think there's more about my experiences at Pitzer that I'll continue to talk about. But I just feel so much gratitude for a school that could look beyond your grades and look at who this person is and what they're like. And it just transformed my life to be able to come to Pitzer.
And she was one of those fun people to be with. She was always talking and asking questions and reaching out and building relationship. I mean, Sarah's always had this vitality that has made her a lot of fun to be with.
Thank you.
Our next question is, how did your Pitzer experience influence the work that you went on to do after leaving college?
Mine was, I loved being here. And I really was questioning. We started a newsletter called Sound Off, and it was kind of an in-house sounding off people. We just ran them off ditto machines back in those days. We'd ran copies off and passed them out. So being the editor of Sound Off gave me a sense of responsibility. But Carl Hertel was a teacher, and he had a tremendous impact on my life. He was teaching indigenous art, the cultural art of the Northwest Coast Indians. And he'd read a lot, and he listened to the things that I was interested in. And he said, you ought to read Carl Jung. You ought to read his Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, his autobiography. I think it would interest you. And I went and bought that book and read it, and I decided I wanted to become a Jungian analyst. And as a result of Carl telling me to read that book, I went after college, I did some interesting things. And then I went and got my master's degree and went to Zurich, Switzerland, and I read the collected works of Carl Jung, the whole collected works of Carl Jung, went through the Propodoidicum, passed all the examinations, became a Jungian psychoanalyst, and came back to Washington to start my practice as a Jungian psychoanalyst. And I'm forever grateful to Carl Hertel for telling me to read that book.
Okay. Well, let's see. One of the biggest experiences for me at Pitzer was was meeting this person, James Joseph, and some of you have heard me talk about him. This is a picture of him. He recently passed away. He was the chaplain of the Claremont Colleges when I was here. And when I came back from Liberia, I was just constantly thinking about this one incident of a woman who said two things to me and changed my life. And she was a Black woman from New Jersey in our group. And when we landed in Liberia, she said, I'm home, and I want you to know I hate white people. And I just looked at her like, hey, that's not the spirit we're supposed to have here. And she looked at me and said, I want nothing to do with you. And accidentally, we got stuck in a situation where the two of us were alone about halfway through the program. And I looked at her and I said, why can't you just accept me for who I am? And she looked at me and she said, how many times do you think I've said that? And my mouth dropped. And I felt like, oh, that's what racism is. Someone doesn't even care who you are. And I was just stunned. And then she looked at me. The second thing she said is, what do you know about what it's like to be Black in America? And I came back from that experience. I mean, she knew I couldn't answer. And I just came back and I think, what is it like being Black in America? I don't know this. I don't know what that's like. And I wanted to learn about the South. And Jim Joseph, as the chaplain, knew my interest. And I was studying sociology and anthropology, and Ruth and Lee Monroe knew that I was interested in this. And he had been at a historically Black college in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, called Stillman College. And he arranged for me. He called me into his office and said, if you want to try this, I'll see if I can set it up. And he said, you could go there for a semester. And I said, well, I'm happy to do it if they'll let me come. And he called and they said yes. And he said, there's one catch. It's an all-Black school. They don't have any white students. And it was like, it's okay with me if it's okay with them. So in 1965, in the spring, I was able to go to Stillman College in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And there is so much that happened for me in that semester. And many of the things changed my life, being there and having the imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan follow me if I left the campus, and having the opportunity to go on a march in Selma with 60 other white people from around Alabama standing up for Black people having the right to vote, and having white people from Selma harassing us and throwing things at us. And Pitzer gave me this chance to try something that was of interest to me and that I wanted to learn about. And that experience of standing up for something that I believed in and that I wanted to understand more really just continued to give me the courage to stand up for things the rest of my life when things have been hard and I've faced battles that were difficult or unpleasant in some way. I could fall back on that. And the day after our demonstration was Bloody Sunday, was known as Bloody Sunday in Selma. And I just feel very grateful to all of the people who supported that kind of courage and strength, and I've learned a tremendous amount from people who could stand up for that. And the day I graduated from Pitzer, the president of the time, there were only 10 of us, and everybody knew that I struggled with writing and reading. And the president of the college, John Atherton, he looked at me as I was standing there, and he said, "And we are all so glad that Sara is graduating today." And I just feel like, it just, what an incredible thing. I mean, I just feel like this gratitude to Pitzer, because it feels like they knew I was a good person and curious and interested, but my grades weren't good, but I graduated from Pitzer College, and I'm proud of it.
Sara, didn't we drive across the country together?
You came with Bob out to
With
Pitzer,
Bob
out to Stillman to
That's
see
right.
me.
We drove out to see you when you were there.
Yeah.
We did fun things together.
We can maybe
What's the question again?
we can connect the next two. We were wondering about how you two met, and also just about your experience at Pitzer,
Okay.
what you would want to know.
Okay. Well, we just met, and Sara was the neatest person, the most outgoing and the most fun person. And we both loved the out of doors. We both loved going hiking. And we went hiking up to, Mount Baldy and up in the foothills here. And her parents were outdoors people, and I went hiking with them too. It was almost like being at Putney and going off on Long Fall on a hiking trip. It was always fun. The thread that I wanted to follow was, after I trained and got my master's degree and studied Jungian psychology, I happened to be living in the house. A friend of mine we were both on the board of William Penn House, a Quaker house in Pennsylvania. And her husband had been asked to be the ambassador to France, and her kids were still at home. So she asked me to stay in the house and take care of the house while she and her husband went off to Paris to be ambassador. And then he was asked to be the ambassador to Moscow when Reagan was president. And so I was living in the home of the American ambassador, and I was practicing Jungian psychology. And there's one idea of Jungian psychology that's interesting, where people tend to project their shadows onto other people. Maybe you've noticed that people that haven't dealt with their own inner shadow, they can project them onto other people. Now, a master of that is Donald Trump. He's always blaming the other for what he's been doing. But it's classic, and I realized that it really characterized the Soviet-American relationship. And the two superpowers in the world had the power to destroy all life on the planet in nuclear war. And they were also trying to destroy each other, because both was projecting. So we brought psychology to bear at a time when we had hair-trigger nuclear alerts. If we launched our nuclear missiles first, the other side was inclined to want to get all their missiles out of the silo so their missiles couldn't be destroyed. And once they've been launched, they can't be retrieved. So it was a very dangerous situation. And we didn't have a way of avoiding it except for a teletype down in the basement of the White House in the Kremlin. We had a teletype that you could say, "Whoops, sorry, we launched some missiles, but don't worry, it was a mistake." And we all realized that the danger of an accidental nuclear war was a terrible, terrible possibility. And so I was using my psychology of the projection of the enemy. Sam Keen had written a book, Faces of the Enemy, and I wanted to use my Jungian work to deal with Soviet-American relations. Out of the fear of frying, nobody wanted to die in an accidental nuclear war. So I began working with a group called Esalen Institute, doing Esalen Soviet-American exchange programs. And I started making frequent trips back and forth between Washington and Moscow. And we were using psychology to deal with complex situations. And I was working with a guy who had studied Robert Assagioli, an Italian psychologist that studied subpersonalities. And he was interviewing Soviet military generals and American generals about MAD, mutual assured destruction. And both sides thought, well, if we're tough and mean enough and we threaten them that we're actually willing to use these nuclear weapons, they will be intimidated by our threats of nuclear war, and they'll step down. And then he interviewed people on the other side, and they were saying essentially the same thing. So we use psychology to help military people on both sides understand that if they acted out their belief system, that if we're tough and mean enough, the other side will step down, was a way of heading toward nuclear war. And that we were bringing awareness, self-awareness, mindfulness to leaders on both sides of the country. We were also, I started in the, at this point I founded the Institute for Soviet-American Relations to improve relations between the superpowers, and we put together a directory of organizations involved in Soviet-American relations because a lot of Americans, recognizing the danger of nuclear war, took the initiative to build connections, to build sister city exchanges, to build people-to-people contacts, to do space bridges, to do joint Soviet-American mountain climbs, to climb to the summit of mountains with Soviets and Americans working together. And it turns out that there were literally hundreds of American groups working, and that blossomed into the time of perestroika when Gorbachev became president after Andropov. Andropov had brought Gorbachev in. And we happened to be working in Moscow and working in all the different republics at a time when things were beginning to open up in the Soviet Union. But there was still the danger of an accidental nuclear war. So we did biofeedback training in the American embassy. We recognized that one of the dangers with nuclear weapons was the human instinct to fight or flight, or be paralyzed, paralysis. But with nuclear weapons, the fight or flight was a disastrous response. And we realized that if the people in Moscow saw a hair trigger, a nuclear alert, there'd be a quick response that would be aggressive and hostile and would be met on the other side with hostility. So we gave training every morning at the American Embassy. Every member of the staff, including the ambassador himself, put little thermometers on their fingers to try to reduce their blood pressure so that there would be a pause. If there were a nuclear alert, everyone in the American Embassy who'd done this training would, instead of reacting immediately, aggressively, harshly, in a reactive way, would take a deep breath, would reduce their blood pressure, would calm themselves down, and would take a thoughtful response and maybe call a Soviet colleague to say, let's talk. There's been a mistake. Let's have a conversation. So we were really training embassy personnel to deal in a thoughtful and a mindful way in the event of a nuclear attack. And then the other thing, at that time, the only way of preventing an accidental nuclear war was these teletypes. And we started doing the first space bridges. We discovered that we could use satellite technology to get the two countries working together. And the first satellite space bridge, I'm just going to say a little bit, because there were a whole series of space bridges, but the first one was Steve Wozniak, the guy who invented Apple Computer, the founder of Apple Computer. Wozniak was a friend of somebody who was working in Moscow who had connections with Gostela Radio, with Vladimir Posner at Gostela Radio. And we got both sides to agree to set up a space bridge when the Apple US Festival was going on in San Bernardino, California. And they opened the studios of Gostela Radio for our people to go into Gostela Radio. And we did the first satellite hookup that was just, satellites were fairly new. It was back in 1983 and 84 that we started doing the first space bridges. And we got kids dancing together. They got up out of their seats, and we had people dancing in Moscow with people in San Bernardino. And it was a real breakthrough. And then we started using space bridges for preventing accidental nuclear war. Space bridges could be used between the White House and the Kremlin to communicate immediately and instantaneously if there was a threat of nuclear war. And we did the nuclear winter. We got scientists in Russia, in the United States and Soviet Union. It was the Soviet Union before the demolition of the end, the end of the empire over there. We got members of Congress talking with each other. Like Patrick Moynihan was on one of the early space bridges, live and unedited. The Soviets trusted us because we were such open and playful and vulnerable and open, ways of let's just getting members of Congress and the Politburo talking with each other. And they allowed us to send these out unedited. It was the first time Moscow had allowed unedited TV to people all over the Soviet Union, all the republics, all the way out to Vladivostok. And so the people all over saw Patrick Moynihan questioning members of the Politburo about human rights violations What about the dissidents in Moscow? How was the government treating the people who disagreed with what the government was doing? Human rights became an issue that was discussed by members of the Congress and the Politburo on the two sides. And that itself was a breakthrough, and there are a whole series of those breakthroughs having real discussions between people on both sides. And it was informed by the very mindful psychology, getting open dialogue, speaking the truth, bringing things out into the open. I was on the first mountain climb between Soviet and American young people climbing to Mount Elbrus. And as we put our ice axes into the ground, we said, we've entrusted our lives to the enemy, to the Soviets. We climbed on ropes going up these rock faces. And we reached the top, and we said, we've trusted each other we want our leaders, Gorbachev and Reagan, to meet and trust each other and to bring about disarmament, to disarm and get rid of these terrible nuclear weapons that were threatening life on the planet. And Ted Turner had gotten CNN offices going in Moscow and was all videoed and shown on television. The young people were really advising the elders that trust in international relations, especially in the Soviet-American domain, was needed and was possible. And we came very close to getting Reagan and Gorbachev to disarm, to dismantle its nuclear arsenals. And we knew what we were doing, and we were right there, but there were hardliners on both sides that were not going to let that happen. Richard Perle, Wolfenson, Victoria Nuland, the hardliners were there, and the hardliners on Russia sabotaged the Helsinki Agreement, and it didn't go through, and the Soviet Union was dismantled. And now we have Putin, and it's a very different era, and we're still struggling with how do we employ what we learned from the days of citizen diplomacy to deal with the crisis in the war in Ukraine now. I'll stop at that, but that's how we got from there to where we are today. So if there are questions, I'd be happy to answer questions because it's a rich field, but I just want to let you know that that's what came out of Carl Hertel telling me to read this book by Carl Jung. And coincidence that my landlord turned out to be the ambassador to Russia. Oh, but I've got one other wonderful story. Can I tell you? Can I tell one more story? It's just a story. Here I am living in the ambassador's residence, doing this citizen diplomacy to bring our people together to, create a better world, working together. And this woman who was kind of the Barbara Walters of Soviet television, her name was Svetlana Stardomskaya, wanted to do an interview with me. And I was so excited. The ambassador said, oh, they'll just make you look bad because the Soviets always make Americans look bad. And they sent the van to pick me up at the ambassador's residence, and I got in. They drove me, the windows were all closed. I thought I was being taken to Siberia, I thought it was the end of the world. I was so scared. And they drove around, and they took me to the Kremlin, and we got out, and we went in, and we were right next to some trees with a Kremlin behind, and they had a picture of her interviewing me, and she said, do you have something you want to say? And I reached into my pocket and I pulled out a crystal because I was passing out crystals. And I said, this crystal was given to me by a friend in America. And she put me right next to a tree that a year before I put a crystal in the crotch of the tree at arm's length. And I stepped over about 3 steps and like here, and I reached over and I pulled up over my head out of the tree a crystal that I'd put there. And I held it up over my head, and this was a crystal from the United States and a crystal from the tree of a crystal. I put the two together, and the lights shined through it and made a circular pattern with the Kremlin in the background. This was a total coincidence. It hadn't been planned that she took me to stand beside this tree that I planted a crystal in. And she said, oh, this is wonderful. Oh, Harriett, this is wonderful. Oh, let me get another picture. Let's get all this light shining. Let's move the camera crew around here, And she arranged the whole thing. And then when we went back, she said, you've got to come into Gospel Radio to help me edit it. So I helped her edit it until it was a really nice thing. But to just complete the story, I went home to be with the Hartmans, and Arthur said, well, they're always going to make Americans look at it. And I said, let's watch Gospel Radio News tonight. So we watched it, and we watched this beautiful edited logo, of these crystals coming together with a sphere of light in the Kremlin in the background, and making friends between the Soviet and American people. And it was beautifully done. And the ambassador said, well, Harriet, they didn't make you look very bad. So magical thing, when you're doing good work, sometimes things beyond your control, like magic, like serendipity, like synchronicities that Jung would talk about, really meaningful coincidences were happening. And it was like a world of miracles, of one thing leading to another. So it's been a very exciting time doing this kind of work. Now I'll stop.
Is there anything you want to say about how you guys met?
Well, I don't remember how we met.
But we love going rock climbing, mountain climbing, we love getting out of doors.
Yeah, I mean, that was the main thing, but I don't know how we found each other.
Well,
there weren't that many people, and I guess we both were outdoorsy people, so we must have just seen each other hanging out outdoors and said, let's go for a walk or something. But it was, and as you can tell, Harriet is a character. And I don't know, we got along, and it was very fun. And
as if you were the character. She's a character
different
too.
kind. But we got to go. She met my family. Her brother came out and went for hikes with my family. So, and part of what I think Pitzer does is it instills this sense of staying connected to each other, and just the what we've seen in these coming togethers for the reunion too is people remembering each other and really appreciating what they had at the time when we knew each other, and that there's something about building on our history that feels important, and that's one of the things that comes from being here and having a place that appreciates the history and encourages people to come together. I guess part of what I thought about my experiences here and how I see them is that I had the opportunities to stand up for things and to be supported in my curiosity, and that allowed me to do so many other things in my life. But there's something about history that I want to try and say something about, and it was somewhat related to my experience in Alabama, related to here, and looking at our family history and the support of people who make a difference in our lives. And I haven't really figured out how to articulate my appreciation of my own history as it relates to the experience I had delving into the issues around race and class, and now I've seen it even more broadly. I feel that there's a way. I feel gratitude. I feel so much gratitude for the life that I've had, and I feel that there's a more common thread that's happening in many parts of the country around land acknowledgement and looking at how being on this land, knowing that I came not here. I wasn't originally from this land. And my family has historically had struggles around our participation in the indigenous people's land being taken. And so my great-grandfather was on the campaign that pursued the Nez Perce, and he was considered, he was a diarist for the general, and he was attributed to recording Chief Joseph's surrender speech. And my family's had this in our history, that we know that. But what happened after that is that he felt horrible about what happened. And he not only felt horrible about it, he tried to figure out what he could do about it. And so he got his law degree, he came back to the Northwest, became friends with Chief Joseph, and tried to help Joseph get his land back. And he and Joseph were relatively the same age, and they both had teenage sons. So my great uncle lived with Chief Joseph in his teepee with Chief Joseph's sons as a teenager. And there's something about utilizing your personal history, whatever it is, and finding ways to transform the messes that we've made. And this lies before us as we look at the climate, as we look at race, as we look at economic differences and homelessness. And it goes on. And as a senior now, I'm 78, more and more people are having health problems and not as able-bodied. And I feel just so much gratitude to be as able-bodied as I am right now. So I think we look at the fortune that we have and look for ways to continue to do good in the world. And Pitzer embodies that. And I've told Pitzer, I'm not one of your major donors. Let's get that really clear. I'm not going to be that. But I have enthusiasm, I have energy, and I'm happy to help support the vision of Pitzer developing all these different aspects of social justice. And I am really continuing to try and find ways to support developing another partnership with historically Black colleges in the South. That's of interest to me, and I'm willing to put time and energy into that. And each of us has passions that matter to us, and that part of what we can do is look to build this and to build it across generations. And it's partly what I loved about meeting Ella, because she and I share a passion for thinking about children. And I know that if I had had a teacher when I was in first grade who could think about children, and they would have seen me as a very terrified little first grader, that they would have gone, what's the matter? Did anything happen? And knowing enough about children, if you've been a child who's been told don't talk about it, you're going to look up at the teacher and go, nothing happened, nothing happened. But any teacher with any sensitivity to children is going, whoa, something happened. And if I had been able to get help back then in first grade, my life would have been different. But my life is how it is now because of that. And so I want to just acknowledge that. And it wasn't until I got divorced in 1972 and went to counseling that this whole picture unraveled, that I understood why I was struggling with reading. And then so I could read, and I went to nursing school, and I graduated with honors. But it was all because of individual people and me seeking out opportunities and people having the insight to be able to provide support and listening and help when I needed it. So we have such different stories. Harriett's global and mine's very personal. But as a woman, I just feel like even in the draft resistance movement and the anti-war movement, the personal is political. And we have to remember that. We have to really own it, that's where my battles were. And then as a single mother and just trying to figure out how to raise a child and to think about children and becoming a midwife and thinking about children in that way. It makes such a difference to own where you are and to feel the strength of your history and to come up with the ideas and passions that you have that can try and help move things forward. So it's all interrelated, and Pitzer's a big part of the rest of my life.
Before we go on, we've got a question from the audience. Do you have something you'd like to bring in?
I think we are going to have time for questions also at the end.
But it's just timely. You who just turned around. Yeah, do you have something you want to say? No, okay. I just thought you were trying to ask a question.
this is sort of connecting, but if you guys wanted to talk about a little bit of the work that you do today and maybe talk about your work with kids and also
Why don't you
you.
go?
Sure. A lot of the work that I've done has been with children. And from what my experience is in India, seeing birth and death in very basic conditions where there was no running water, no electricity, no medical care. I had the privilege of seeing birth and death. And that again is another eye-opener that changed my life. And I came back to the US in 1968, and 2 years later I was married and pregnant, and childbirth back then was bizarre, with women's legs being up in stirrups, and it was like the whole thing, when it was just like, whoa, you're kidding, people do that? It's like, that's not how regular people have babies. And it was just, and I had my daughter at home. There were no midwives, no doctors. And I lived 5 minutes from Stanford, and I knew the risks. When I was in India, I saw babies die. But my work has been thinking about babies and mothers and families, and then helping also when they die. So I've done labor and delivery, midwifery, and hospice nursing. And I feel like just so fortunate to have been able to see what natural birth looks like and natural death. And especially now, as I'm aging, I have more and more people who are dying in my life. And I get a chance to help make death be understood, and to help people not be afraid of it, and to help people accept it. And I have a quick story. Many of you have probably known about this this person. Do you know that picture of the migrant mother? Yeah. Okay. I had the honor to take care of her when she was dying. And again, it was just given to me. I was, working as a nurse, and this is who you're going to take care of. So it unfolded. But this became using yourself as the tool of being able to show compassion and care to somebody. By the time I saw her, it was she wasn't really talking, but her son was taking care of her with her grandson and his wife, and I had the opportunity to help them. They were running out of money to take care of her at home, and I said, I think that if we let people know that you could use some financial help, it would be like a GoFundMe thing, that people would support you, because she mattered to people. And they had tremendous anxiety about this photograph. The family hated how it was done. They felt sort of ripped off and not respected by how it was handled. But I would help the family agree to think about letting it be known. And we got an article in the paper that went out that they agreed to and supported happening. And thousands of dollars came pouring in the mail. This was before internet, in envelopes with little messages. I love this picture of your mother, and your mother matters to me. I'm a single mother, and I see strength in your mother. I mean, the letters from architects and doctors and poor people, and just, it was all over the map. And when she died, they had over 1,000 letters from people and over $20,000 left after they paid all their expenses that they then donated to hospice. But there's something about being able to be involved in people's lives in a very personal way that sort of is what I can bring. And then I have helped a number of other friends and family people and people in my official hospice capacity, just face the issues that they have to face as they're dying.
My question for you, how did you see the opportunity of some extraordinary choices rather than the fear about what it was going to be like to go to a place where babies were being born, in horrible circumstances? How did you?
I mean, it wasn't.
How did it paralyze you?
It wasn't horrible circumstances. I mean, to me, it wasn't horrible. I mean, Harriett and I we both hike. We were both outdoors people. And there was something about no electricity and no running water that was familiar. And it was just, you go to the bathroom outside. I mean, it's just, so that wasn't horrible. And then babies being born is just babies being born. And it was actually looked rather normal. And so that wasn't hard for me.
She wasn't afraid. She just plain wasn't afraid.
Yeah.
And she had a way to find a perspective that made it into an illuminating, ennobling experience.
Meaningful. She made it meaningful.
Yeah.
She brought her own meaning to being with people as they were dying.
Yeah.
I find that not only wonderful but hopeful.
Yeah.
And the thought right now that what she experienced is happening now in the world, that people are poor, and even in California,
Yeah.
they're living in shelters and sleeping. I passed out my freeway where I live, tennis shoes on the side and big flip-flops, and that's somebody's son.
Yeah.
Laying there.
Yeah.
A beautiful young person.
Yeah. Yeah.
No hope, no nothing.
Yeah.
And my kids always said, "Don't you pick up anybody."
Well, and that's our challenge, is to deciding what challenges do we take on, which ones are that we really can right now. And
In the neighbor pamphlets too, all of the promises that they made in those talks. There's one tribe that they honored, I thought about last week. The trees they made. And even now, they can't own property.
yeah.
They can't go off the family reservation.
Yeah.
So we still have major problems right in California.
Yeah. Yeah.
And other states.
Yeah.
The suicide rate is high.
No, these are things
there's plenty of issues.
these are things we're all really concerned about, and how we can bring hope with stories like Sarah's. And
Yeah, and that's hope in this room because of the story.
Do you, Harriett, want to talk a little bit about your work?
yeah, but I just think Pitzer is doing a lot to bring hope to the students that are studying here, and inspiration. And I looked at all those posters on the wall of different things that kids are doing here at Pitzer, and Pitzer is inspiring people to take on some of these really challenging issues, homelessness and migration, and meeting people's needs. And I think Pitzer is doing a lot in the area that you're bringing up. If to kind of continue the story that I've been telling. What are you doing now? And I want to draw from what I've said before about citizen diplomacy, because I'm always trying to deal with the big issues of our time. My boyfriend is always saying, "Why aren't you dealing with the big issues of our time?" And I am. And I work with the Ukrainians, with people in the Zelensky administration, and I'm really empowered by the hopefulness and the courage of the people of the Ukraine to be fighting back at this time, and we're doing what we can to support them. And right now, what I'd like to bring consciousness to, in Belarus, President Putin has said that he's going to be taking tactical nuclear weapons and putting them on the border between Belarus and Russia. And this would be a terrible escalation of the threat of a nuclear exchange that would involve NATO nations. And it would just put us one step closer. We're already very close to the doomsday time clock, but bringing nuclear weapons into Belarus would be really bad. And I'm working with people who have ways of organizing the people of Belarus. The people of Belarus do not like nuclear weapons. They do not like nuclear energy. They fought against nuclear power plants. The explosion at Chernobyl, the fallout went largely on Belarus. The people of Belarus elected a leader, Svetlana, who's in exile right now because the president of Belarus is a pal of Putin's in a military alliance with Putin. And so right now I'm raising money and supporting work to organize and mobilize the citizens of Belarus to resist the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. And just in the last couple of weeks, they've identified the deployment sites where Russia plans to put tactical nuclear weapons. There are 3 sites that they're planning on taking nuclear weapons into. And we're organizing citizens in those areas to boycott the labor that would be working at construction at those sites, preparing those sites for holding nuclear weapons. And they'd be holding ICBMs, international ballistic missiles, which could be directed at countries in Europe and in America. All of what Sara was doing in working with the people who were resisting the recruitment of young people going to Vietnam, all the organizing that went into that to empower the young men of America to say no to war and to refuse to go to war in Vietnam. And with Joan Baez and David and this wonderful movie that if you ever have a chance to see this movie about the boys who said no. We need to do that in Belarus, to organize the citizens to empower themselves, to get out on the streets and block the roads where the weapons are coming in in traffic in big trucks and railways, and then to blockade the construction of the sites where they're planned to be deployed, because the Belarusian citizens are really ready to resist the deployment. And we're doing all we can to help them organize to block that and to strengthen the citizens of the Belarus in a democratic fashion. But that's what the work that I'm doing now. I'm working on. And it's hopeful, we can take on the big issues and we can have an impact. And we can stop bad things from happening, because we're really envisioning that I think we're going through the eye of a needle. We're at the tipping point. We're on the tip of the tipping point into possible collapse of ecosystems, possible nuclear exchange of weapons, code red for the environment, loss of biological diversity, extinction of species. Even human beings are on the potential extinct. We could go extinct. We're living at a very dangerous time, and my solution is really simple, that each one of us must find the calm, quiet center within ourselves of mindfulness through meditation and through mindful awareness to stay clear and centered and are grounded in the natural world, in nature, in Mother Earth, recognizing the sacredness of our Mother Pachamama, Mother Nature. And I think as we ground ourselves in what's true, then we can work on any level of the threats right now, because I truly believe that we're going to come through these multiple crises that we're going through into a better era in which we've evolved beyond the threat of nuclear war, in which we're respecting life on the planet. We're protecting the Endangered Species Act, the protection of the natural world. And I think we're moving into a better world, and it's going to call on each of us to stay centered within ourselves and to work on whatever level we can to take us to a new day, a day in which we're living in harmony with the natural world.
And I think just right on with that, the other crisis I think that's happening right now, where there's a tipping point, is the mental health of children. And if we're looking at how to build a society where people can function more with more compassion and with more interest in working across differences, we really need to change a lot of how children are treated and the kind of support that parents are given in the incredibly challenging work of parenting. And so I think part of what I think is critical is that as much as possible, that we all try and build more relationships with young people, and to think about who are the young people, where are the places in your neighborhood where there are young people. I heard Marian Wright Edelman talk at a conference once, who started the Children's Defense Fund. And she looked out at this conference with thousands of people, and she said, "You may feel like there's nothing you can do." And she looked out and she goes, "Know the children in your neighborhood by name, find out what they like to do, shoot a couple hoops with them once in a while, really engage with young people so that we can stop having this divide of them being sort of not respected and included in the incredible challenges that they are going to be facing. And we want them to know that they have allies out there that will help them as they are trying to come up with their idea of something they'd like to help make better. And I've seen lots of young people choose a project for some class where they want to support the local humane society, or they want to, send letters to somebody, to some other country, or we just have to find ways to listen to children and to support them. And there's lots of organizations out there that will provide opportunities to build connections with children. And I think that's the larger global issues are out there, and then the issues about how we help sort of nurture this young population of young people growing up is critical to being able to do it successfully.
Bravo.
We have about 15 minutes for questions. If anybody has questions, I think there's going to be somewhere maybe where you can submit the questions. There might be a QR code up there in a minute, but
some people may
also
not know about this.
You can also just ask your questions. Yes.
So my name is Will. Thank you for giving a talk. So me and my friend Jack are from Harriett College, and we're both doing degrees in physics and chemistry. And I wanted to ask your advice for not just us, for the students of Harriett, but sort of the future scientists. What advice would you give to understanding their impact in different communities?
Understanding your impact?
I guess understanding the impact that scientists have in communities, because maybe those are a group of individuals who are not usually focused on how they're impacting others.
Well, the first thing I think of is build relationships with people who aren't in science, because science is being attacked right now. I mean, my daughter lives in Florida, and science is being majorly attacked. And I think that some of it is that the elite educated people have a point of view about rationality that seems so basic. But there are many people in the world who just find it it's like a class distinction. It's like, you just think you're better than us. You just think you know so much science. And it's like, what about, it's just being open to meeting people who are really different from you. And I think that's a place to start. So I don't know if it's volunteering in some program that's at where you get to just see a different point of view. And your work is critical. I mean, that's the thing. There's so much, depending on where you're going with chemistry and, medicine or wherever you're going with your ideas. My brother-in-law was an astronomer and did all this work about astrophysics and the universe and interstellar gases. And to us, it was like, what is this about that he studies? But everybody has a role to play, and someone who understands that domain is contributing to the knowledge about how the world works. And we can't forget that lots of people don't understand that, but they're still trying to figure out how their world works.
That was a good answer. I can't do any better, man.
Yeah. Let us know what you come up with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anybody else have questions? Or just
I'm
want?
sure I have questions, but I feel like I want to take the time
Yeah.
and settle.
Yeah.
I'm so proud to have been in your class and known you when you were young like me. I mean, all these years, and you just make me too proud. Yeah.
Wow.
Thank you guys.
Well, I'm really proud of Pitzer and all the wonderful things that have happened here at Pitzer. And
Yeah.
it's just so beautiful walking around and looking at the murals on the walls and the new buildings. And wow, the place is thriving. I'm so proud to be a part of this.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to share all this. It's really interesting to me to try and imagine how to talk about some of these things, and just really wonderful to. Yeah.
Sarah, I was going to ask you this later, but I'll ask it now. So you spent the semester at Stillman, and it sounded like one of the thoughts or prompts you to do this was the question I actually asked you. So I'm just curious, what did you learn about being Black in America that the semester you were at Stillman? Can you share very much about that?
I mean, it's an ongoing process. My God, I feel like when I took a bus from LA across the country to Birmingham or to Tuscaloosa in 1965, I got to Texas and they had bathrooms that said white and colored, and I had to go to the bathroom. And it's like, what am I supposed to do? I mean, there's just dilemmas in life where it's not clear. And I thought, am I invading someone's space if I go in the black bathroom? Is that okay? Am I colluding with the oppression and the racism if I go to the white bathroom, but I had to go to the bathroom? And it was like, okay, you just have to decide. And then there were the drinking fountains that were, this one said, whites only. And this one said colored. And it's like the mental dilemmas that I felt confronted with. And I feel like there's a sense of what I've learned about white privilege that I had no understanding of. And I'm learning more and more every day about what that looks like. So it's an ongoing process. And there's an idea of entitlement that I had never understood. And I'm seeing it more and more with friends who want to say, oh, I'm not prejudiced, I'm not racist. And it's like, it's something that being white in America, it's just, we have perpetuated it unknowingly. And I had the opportunity to go to the memorial for Jim Joseph. And there were all of these African American people there who are involved in philanthropy. That was one of his major passions, was really supporting the access to financial wealth for Black people. And so he had cultivated many, many organizations, and so they're working to get income to help Black people get access to owning their own houses and recapturing some wealth that can be then passed on. And I think, I feel like I'm just having my eyes opened. If I keep looking, I can find another layer of what it means for someone to be Black in America and dealing with the historical trauma. And I'm thinking of trying to organize a group to go to Alabama next spring. And there's such incredible civil rights museums in Montgomery and in Birmingham and in Selma. And some of it is just learning the history. And that is just so powerful. And so I'm definitely still in the learning category of just trying to understand it. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about realizing some things about the place of women in our society. And
The place of what?
Women.
that was something that was personally something that I got to think about at Pitzer. And I'm hearing that some of the work that you've both been involved in is, like working with children and how important that is, helping mothers, helping the whole maternal process of, helping prenatal and postnatal health and all that. So I was just going to ask you, did Pitzer have some seeds of that helped you develop, or was part of your personal path? Just considering, okay, what does it mean to be a woman in this society, no matter what color you have? Is that part of your personal?
Well, the fact that we came to a women's college definitely supported us as women, and without there were no men on the students at the time. And I think that supported me, just being in a women's college. And I had so many other issues to try and deal with that it was like, but I felt like Pitzer wasn't in and of itself nurturing that seed per se, but it was by supporting me, that supported that seed of women's voices being worth listening to, and listening to my story or Harriet's story or interests. It's like taking women seriously in a way that sometimes the way male domination works is the louder voices and take over. So
Really, during that time, it was such a remarkable experience to come to a college.
say it louder.
It was such a remarkable experience for all of us who were there at the time to come to this college that was dedicated to women,
Yeah.
but also had no traditions whatsoever.
Oh.
Had no government, had no infrastructure, and it was really up to us to put it in place.
Yeah.
And there wasn't anyone telling us that you're just a girl. You can't possibly do this. It was very much. Rose Monroe never did that. No, I don't think so. And I think the whole faculty at the time was very much engaged in the idea of teaching women that we have a voice, that we have ideas, and they're valuable.
I think that was the whole premise of being here at Pitzer, was do whatever you want to do and never let being a woman get in the way of what you want to do. One of the things that gave me the courage to do when I was living in Washington and working part-time in the White House during the Clinton administration, summers I went out to South Dakota on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation and worked with a medicine man who taught me how to do vision quests. And so for 6 years, I was going out there doing hombleche, vision quests, going out for 4 days and 4 nights with no food and no water. And then coming in and doing the Sundance. And I was the only white person in a Sundance with Lakota Sioux. And sometime when my protector, Richard Movescamp, wasn't there, I felt very unprotected because I was with all the women. But I found a role for myself because in the sweat lodge, in those 4 days, every morning starts with a sweat lodge and then ends with a sweat lodge, and then the women stay in one tent and the men stay in another tent. And when the women, when their feet hurt, I'm trained in reflexology. I massage their feet. And whenever an older Indian woman, she said, "Oh, my feet, my back is just aching. Harriett, get over here and work on my feet." And I found a perfect role for myself because I just move over in front of them and I could work on their back by working along the reflexology lines of their inside. And I could do little small circles up and down the inside. And I loved it, and I felt I found my role. I'm massaging the feet of the women who are dancing here. And so I was working all the time, but I love working with my hands. Yeah. And I'm really deeply satisfied by working with the hands and relieving pain. But you know, there wasn't very much water, and there's a water tank up there, and it was the white people who brought the water in. And we were dependent on the white people bringing the water tank and bringing it in. And I felt the vulnerability. What if the white people don't bring the water for us? You know, we're going to die. And then what they do, well, they help you to laugh at yourself, because after 4 days of dancing in the sun with no food and water, your mouth is kind of sticky because you're so thirsty, you know. And then you're just waiting for it to be over when you can get something to drink. And the Hyoka, the Indian jokers, come out with a bucket of water and a ladle, and they come dancing up to you, and you're just so ready. Water. And they pour it on the ground, and they look at your reaction. They just start laughing at you, you know. And at first, I was just outraged. What are these guys doing? Laughing at us, you know. But they got me to laugh at myself. And then I'm laughing with them, and I go through a whole dealing with my own self-importance and self-esteem, and they're laughing at me, and I'm laughing at me, and we're just, and then they come out with sandwiches, and they pretend to be like white people, you know, and everybody else is around, and they just eat a little bit and throw it over their shoulder, and they're just kind of casually, and I'm laughing at that too, because that's how we appear to them. And I really made some deep friendships, you know, there. A woman that I got to know worked in the slaughterhouse, and her job was to gut the cow coming around, you know, in the slaughter and pull the guts out of it. Can you imagine doing that as a job? And it really opened my eyes to, and I've always had a great deal of respect for the Indians and the Lakota Sioux and their traditional ways, their songs and their dances. And we do sweat lodges on my farm. And I just really honor the Native American Indians, and it was a great honor to be dancing with them. But I don't think I would have done that if I hadn't gone to Pitzer, because Pitzer says go out and do whatever you want to do. It laid the groundwork. Yeah.
It's just 2:30 now, so I think we might.
I would love to hear, before you go, if there's any thought you have about something that you take away from this. Because, you know, sometimes it's just like you just tell stories, and it's like, was this interesting or insightful in some particular way that you could share? Yeah.
I'll just say one thing. I just love the idea that...
You what?
I love the idea that there can be a global and personal approach. That really resonated with me because I want to justify my own existence because nothing I've done is global.
Yeah.
But maybe not.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, parenting is global. You just don't know. I mean, Harriett, your world is grander than you can see from your perspective, but not all of us have that. So I'm really gratified to hear that, to the kind of the spectrum of donation.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
What a beautiful balance.
Yeah, yeah.
We really do balance each other. I've always thought of us as alike. We're both characters.
Well, that's good too.
Yeah, yeah, but it also, you're very hope-inducing because you're telling the stories of what you've done over time. And one of the things that I have struggled with in my work for social justice is, it gets discouraging. And you feel like taking a sabbatical, for a while.
Mhm.
And, you learn, and you've certainly demonstrated that some things take a long time. Two things. Some things just take a long time.
Yeah.
And a lot of people. And some things are right in front of you.
Yeah.
And you just have to keep going.
Yeah.
And when we meet people who kept going, and the results have been so great,
Yeah.
and you also seem to have, I can't speak for you on this, but you both seem to be so integral with yourselves.
Mhm.
And that only comes with time, I think,
Mhm.
and trying out all these things.
Yeah.
But hanging in
Yeah.
is you demonstrate
Mm.
hanging in.
Yeah.
And that energizes me. So
Mm.
thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Melinda.
Just to piggyback on what you were saying, and I see both of them with their integrity. It's developed over time, but it was a moment by moment.
Yeah.
And each moment had to go as deep as you could go in those decisions.
Mm.
And the other pattern I saw is that you kept going into one amazing experience and story after another. You never knew how it was going to end up. Somebody who doesn't read is applying for college. Really?
To all that in reverse, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and
But not knowing how it's going to turn out,
Yeah.
going, that's what it is. You don't know what's going to happen, but you knew deeply that the process was going to be what you were learning.
Well, I just think that's a great thing to talk about here at the end, is that you don't know how it's going to turn out. And that at our age, I feel like we don't know how this is all going to turn out. And I find that one of the most challenging things for me right now is being a grandmother and having an 8-year-old grandson who's an angry little boy. And I get pushed to the place of just feeling despair about the future of young children. And I have to work so hard to come back to figuring out how to play with him and get him involved in something to do with nature and not screens. And it's just, so we have this place, and I feel I have no idea how it's going to end, where it's going to go. But every time I fly to Florida, I get to try again and try and bring my full self to him and find a way to engage with him in some way that's going to be beneficial to his development. But it's like there's so much we don't know, including the science. It's just, we all have these places where we don't know where it's going to go. But you get to keep looking for opportunities to try something. And that's the hope, is that you get to come up with another idea of something to try.
Well, I think, I would think personally, Carol does it. It's been hard for me to come back to Pitzer in some ways. Mainly because I love it so much. And I wasn't able to finish my senior year. Yeah. There were some circumstances in my family that just didn't want to let me go there again.
Mm.
And so I have some real grief about, being here. And it's handy having a husband who's a psychologist too. We processed them before I got on the plane. But, one thing is you only feel grief when the things that have been so valuable to you, you've been able to experience.
Mm.
You know, you miss the gifts that you were given, but everything has its time and season and so forth. And hearing you guys talk has helped me be really grateful.
Mm.
And know that there's so many times in my life, you know, including right now, where I take some of those things that I got here, and I'm just damn grateful for that.
I'm grateful too for just having been here at Pitzer.
And it's such a wonderful reminder of when we all came to Pittsburgh.
Oh.
Quite frankly, you know, we all benefited from our time.
From our time at Pitzer. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.